Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Jeremiah chapter 31, and we're going to get back to that. But I took a little time to deal with a thought that is brought out here that applies to us today, and that is that God is not seeking to just merely have a religious experience. In other words, when you encounter someone, to turn them to God doesn't mean you give them a list of do's and don'ts, good and bad things to do. Most of Christendom teaches some form of good works to be right with God. That's an error. What this verse shows us, of course, and as we come into the New Testament, is that God is changing our nature, changing our hearts, and then writing his laws on our hearts. So the right and the wrong that we seek to do by doing good deeds, which we fail, okay, God has written it on our hearts. So let's get back to Jeremiah chapter 31, and I'm going to start back. Um, so just so we know again the context here, um, in the midst of this prophecy is in the midst of Jerusalem and Judea being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So some of the previous prophecies basically has told Israel, well, you're going to be conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Reality check. It's going to happen. Those who surrender, you're going to be taken captive into Babylon. And then he tells them, settle in, build houses, marry, live your life. 70 years is decreed for that exile. And then after 70 years, I'm going to bring you back into the land. Okay. And then I'm going to restore you to the land. And that has a near fulfillment prophecy and a far prophecy. So now in the prophecy here, then he is also giving us prophecy about God's plans for them in the future. In other words, going beyond the destruction, the exile. And this is one of them. So he says, verse 31 again, look, the days are coming, which means they're not here. This is the Lord's declaration when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So a new covenant then here, or sometimes we can even call it the New Testament, but the new covenant, and it's going to be based upon something different than the old covenant. Now we spend a few. If you want to go back and look at some of the previous studies here, well, one of the problems is that he said, well, what was the whole issue with the law? The law was given because of transgression. So that's why we don't have the law didn't work. So this is why the need for a new covenant. Verse 32, he said, no, we'll go back. He says, look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Now, interesting, he mentions the house of Israel because remember at this time, Israel has been off of the scene, out of the scene now for nearly 80 years. As the Assyrians conquered them, they were more wicked than Judah. But then in the restoration, so always understand this, that this, what the Lord is referring to, is fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant, which the descendants of Abraham, that God is going to fulfill his promise to them, which means the land. He's going to give them the land. So then But in order for that to happen, he also says, y'all got to be right, because this is the reason why you're in the predicament that you're in, because you're not right. So then he says, verse 32, this one will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant they broke, even though I had married them. The Lord's declaration. So they bring them out, and we again, from this perspective, this is about 1,000 years, right, of history. They continually broke his covenant. He brought them out of Egypt. No other nation had their God. Now, every other nation had pagan worship, deities, all fake, right? Because none of them manifested themselves to be true. Israel is the only one that could say that they had a history where their God manifested himself. First and foremost, brought them out of slavery by a nation that held them in slavery for 400 years. And by the way, had no plans of releasing them. God came along and said, you're going to release my people. He literally crippled the nation of Israel, brought them out by the miraculous signs and wonders, the parting of the Red Sea, as he was leading them by a cloud by day and a fire by night, to miraculous manifestations of their God. So God brought them out, but they still they still continue to break his covenant. Verse 33, instead, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, the Lord's declaration. I will put my teaching within them and write it on their heart, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. This is the Lord's declaration, for I will forgive their wrongdoing and never again remember their sins. Now, I said I was going to go back to this here, but there's one other thought that I have to address here, a blessing that I just cannot let go. So let me do this, and then we may have to come back to this. And but here it is. Notice the verse 34, and this is going to be something that I want to deal with too, because wow, look at this. No longer will one teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, know the Lord. So, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. And then he said, this is the Lord's declaration. So stop for that for a moment. Just look at that. So this is the new covenant. But this is the impact. This is the result of what Jesus is going to do on the cross. Now, we still have this today. Unfortunately and sadly, in churches today, Christian churches. One of the reasons why people go to church is to hear from God, right? So I have to be careful here so that I can do a balance. So to be at the end of this, you understand what I'm saying, and certainly what I'm not saying. Meaning this. So let's start with this, and then I'll tidy it up. Why do people go to church every Sunday? And when you listen to, let's say, the average church member, they go to church to hear from God, to hear a message from God. Of course, the Catholic Church is worse. They think that the priests, the hierarchy, are the mediators between lay people and then the clergy. Now, again, Protestant brought that baggage with them, as I told you before. But when you go back to the Catholic ideology, if you go all the way up to the Pope is the vicar of Christ, right? When he sits in the papal chair, guess what? He is speaking as God. So he's like Moses. Now, when you go back right here, the nature of what he's saying to us right here, the nature of this is that you will not have this mediator. Israel, in fact, um, one of the reasons why he's even saying this is because there was one occasion about 3 months after God brings them out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. Now, had they obeyed God, they probably would have went into the promised land anywhere between the third month or the second year. In other words, when they went in their second year, they would have went into the promised land. The sin caused them to wander 40 years. But on one of these occasions, Moses went up and God came down on the mountain, and it was this terrifying event that happened. The mountain shook, quake, black pillows of smoke, everything, and the people were kind of like, "What? God, ooh, we don't want to come near, right? We no." And then they said this, Moses, you speak to us for God. And so Moses then was the spokesman of God. When God wanted to communicate something to Israel, Moses came and says, "Thus saith the Lord." And then, as a result of that, what followed was the ministry of the prophet. He would speak God's voice to the king. Then the king would, should have, right, guided the people by that prophetic guidance by God through the prophet, the king, then to the people. Okay, so that was a hierarchy when in the Old Testament. Now, when you come to the New Testament, the Pharisees uh, they assume that position, but God did not place them in that position. As a result, there was an extremely amount of hypocrisy, because again, power, it gains power. And the same thing happened in the Catholic Church. You got this hierarchy, they're power-driven people, that they're not leading the people to God. So the Pope wake up and he says, "Oh, this is my edict," right? For example, all of these little weird doctrines they have. Mary, praying to Mary, celibacy, right? Nuns and priests, y'all don't get married, right? One Pope woke up and says, "Okay, nutty, everybody's got to be celibate." God never said that. God never said that. The average person, you don't go to God, right? Despite God telling us, despite Jesus saying to us, instead of praying to saints, praying to Mary, the Catholic would say, "Oh yeah, I want the saints praying for me because, after all, Mary, Mother of God, right? If Mary's the Mother of God, couldn't she influence Jesus?" Now, why am I saying this? Because no longer, verse 34, will he teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, "Know the Lord, know the Lord, for they will all know me." And the reason why the Catholics say that is because they don't know the Lord. Why? Because they're kept from knowing the Lord. They're kept from knowing the Lord. And that's the sad thing. Now, so that's why they pray to statues, they pray to Mary, they pray to relics, okay, they pray to saints, because they don't know the Lord. And yet, I'm going to watch this. So, 16. This is, to me, one of the most, where am I at? I'm going to start reading verse 23. Now, remember, I just read to you where it says, "They all will know me," right? They all will know me. Now notice God is speaking this in the Old Testament. So watch this. Verse 23. This is John 16, verse 23. In that day, now he's speaking to the disciples. Ultimately, then he's speaking to us. So in that day, notice this, you will not ask me anything. I assure you, anything you ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have asked for nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, so that your joy may be complete. I have spoken these things to you in figures of speech. A time is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures, but I will tell you plainly about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I am not telling you that I will make requests to the Father on your behalf. For the Father himself loves you because you've loved me, because you have believed that I came from God. Now notice this wonderful promise here. The Father himself. So this is why I say the corruption in the Catholic doctrine that drives you away from God and have people content in praying to statues and Mary and saints. Why would you want to pray for them when you can come and pray directly to God? Let me go to one other verse. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, and I want to pick it up at verse number. Here I'm around verse 12. I'll pick it up at verse number 14. It says, all those led by God's Spirit are God's Son. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies together with our spirits that we are God's children. And if children, also heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, so that we suffer with him, so that we may be glorified with him. Notice this promise here that we cry out, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. So now, let's go back and compare this again, verse 34. No longer will each one teach his neighbor and his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. Now think about that. All will know me, from the least to the greatest of them. So God's desire is for all of us to know him. So now, when you think about religion, man-made religion, what do? They direct you from going directly to God. Now, again, as I told you, I want to be careful, because God does put ministry gifts into the body. Apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teacher, but not as mediators. That's not why he put these ministry gifts in. So the pastor of a church, or an apostle, and do I believe that all of these ministry gifts exist today? I have no problems with that, as long as you meet these scriptural criteria. But at the same time, just think about this for a moment now. Just think about this idea that that God wants you to come directly to him. How do you do that? By his Spirit. Now, the pastors and the ministry gifts, they teach us. They are put in the church to shepherd, to teach, to cause us to grow. But they're not in any way the mediator. That we should never focus so on them that we think we can't go directly to our Heavenly Father. Because what? He's given us his Spirit crying out, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. All right, guys. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it, excuse me, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you in the next study.